Hello, and welcome to The Unseen Question. I grew up surrounded by people who believed in God, people who went to churches, mosques, or temples, who prayed before meals, who said things like, "God has a plan," when something went wrong. For a long time, I went along with it, because when you're young, you don't really question what everyone around you accepts. You just absorb it. It feels safe to believe what everyone else believes. But at some point, I started to notice cracks. I realized that a lot of the answers given to me weren't really answers. If I asked why bad things happen to good people, I'd get vague lines about mystery and divine will. If I asked why God doesn't show himself in a clear way, people would say that's where faith comes in. And the more I heard these replies, the more I understood that faith wasn't filling gaps in knowledge. It was being used to avoid them. That was the beginning of a shift. Not a sudden rejection, but a gradual process of asking myself whether I was believing something because it was true or because it was comforting. And when I stripped away the comfort and looked only at evidence, I found less and less reason to hold on to the idea of God. One of the first things that stood out to me was how human religions really are. Every culture across history has invented gods, spirits, and myths that fit their own time and place. The gods of ancient Greece behaved like flawed humans with more power. The gods of Egypt mirrored their environment, tied to the Nile and the sun. In parts of the world with harsh winters, myths often revolved around cycles of death and rebirth, tied to the seasons. What this showed me is that gods don't reveal themselves in a universal, consistent way. Instead, they look suspiciously like reflections of human imagination and circumstance. Then I noticed something else. People often argue that morality proves God must exist, that without him, we'd have no basis for right and wrong. But morality doesn't look like it came from any divine source. It looks like it evolved with us, shaped by survival and cooperation. We can see hints of morality in other species too. Primates will share food, elephants show grief, wolves punish members of the pack who don't cooperate. These aren't religious creatures, but they display behaviors that resemble fairness, empathy, and punishment of wrongdoing. That tells me morality is older than scripture. It's not written on stone tablets from above. It's written into the biology of social animals trying to survive together. And when we look at scripture itself, the claim that morality comes from it falls apart even faster. Holy books often promote ideas we now see as immoral: slavery, subjugation of women, intolerance of outsiders, violent punishments for minor offenses. If morality truly flowed from a perfect, timeless being, why would his books reflect the prejudices and ignorance of the societies that wrote them? Another point that kept pushing me away from belief was the way religions claim certainty while constantly disagreeing with one another. Billions of people around the world are utterly convinced that their specific version of God is the real one. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, they can't all be right. And if divine truth were real and clear, wouldn't it be obvious to everyone? Instead, what we see is a patchwork of beliefs shaped by geography and upbringing. A child born in Riyadh is likely to grow up Muslim. A child born in Rome is likely to grow up Catholic. Belief follows borders, not evidence. That realization cut deep for me. If I had been born somewhere else, I would probably believe in a completely different God with the same certainty I once felt, which means certainty isn't proof. It's just indoctrination combined with habit. And then there's the silence of unanswered prayers, the silence of disasters wiping out entire communities, regardless of how faithfully they prayed. People will say, God works in mysterious ways, but that phrase is really just a way of hiding the fact that nothing happened. If a child survives an accident, it's called a miracle. But if 10 children die in the same event, that's brushed aside as part of God's plan. When you look at it honestly, it's not a plan, it's randomness, and people only attribute meaning after the fact. Over time, I started comparing God to other explanations humans once believed in. We used to think lightning was Zeus throwing bolts. Now we know it's electricity in the atmosphere. We used to think diseases were curses from spirits. Now we know about bacteria and viruses. In every case, the natural explanation replaced the supernatural one, and never the other way around. That pattern is telling. The more we learn, the less room there is for gods. I also had to confront the problem of suffering. If there really were a powerful, loving being overseeing everything, why would the world look the way it does? We don't just see human cruelty, we see natural cruelty, predators tearing prey apart, parasites eating animals from the inside out, entire species wiped out by floods, fires, and asteroids long before humans even appeared. What possible purpose could that serve under a benevolent creator? It doesn't fit. It makes far more sense in a universe that wasn't designed with us in mind. The more I asked these questions, the more I saw how religion often functions less as truth and more as a human invention to provide comfort and control. Comfort because it promises life after death. Control because it tells people to obey rules not because they're reasonable, but because they're said to come from ultimate authority. And when authority claims divine backing, it's hard to challenge. That's why, throughout history, religion has been used to justify power structures, wars, and oppression. It wasn't just about personal belief, it was about social control. And yet, I don't say this with anger. I understand why people believe. The fear of death is powerful. The need for purpose is real. The desire to feel guided, protected, and loved on a cosmic scale is deeply human. But wanting something doesn't make it true. And that's the core of why I don't believe in God. When I hold belief up to the standard of evidence, reason, and consistency, it falls apart. When I let go of belief in God, something surprising happened. Instead of feeling empty, I felt free. Free to look at the world as it really is, without bending it to fit ancient stories. Free to accept that not everything has a neat explanation yet, and that uncertainty is okay. Free to ask questions without fear of crossing invisible lines. I started noticing how much richness reality has on its own. The night sky doesn't need to be a ceiling painted by a creator. It's billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars. The complexity of life doesn't need to be explained as the work of a designer. It's the result of billions of years of evolution, trial and error, survival and adaptation. To me, that's more awe-inspiring than any miracle written in a book thousands of years ago. The human brain itself is another example. For centuries, people thought consciousness must come from a soul breathed into us by God. But modern neuroscience keeps showing us how thoughts, emotions, and memories emerge from the physical brain. Damage one part of the brain, and a person's personality can change. Stimulate another part, and they can feel religious visions or out-of-body experiences. If those experiences can be triggered with electrodes and chemicals, then they're not glimpses into a divine realm, they're products of biology. This doesn't make them less meaningful as experiences, but it changes what they represent. They tell us more about ourselves than about a deity. The fact that mystical visions vary depending on culture also supports this. A Christian might see Jesus during a near-death experience. A Hindu might see Krishna. A Buddhist might feel merging with universal energy. The brain seems to generate what the culture primes it to expect. That's not evidence of multiple gods. It's evidence of the human mind filling in blanks with its own stories. Another thing that stood out to me was how religion often claims to give life meaning. People say, without God, everything is pointless. But when you think about it, the opposite is true. If life is just a test before eternity, then this life is downgraded. It's just a waiting room for the real thing. But if this life is the only one we have, then every moment matters infinitely more. Every act of kindness, every connection, every chance to learn or create. It all matters because it's not temporary filler, it's the whole thing. And when people argue that God gives them purpose, what they usually mean is that religion handed them a ready-made script. But purpose doesn't have to be handed down from above. We create it ourselves, through relationships, through learning, through building, through experiencing. That purpose is flexible, personal, and real, not borrowed from an ancient authority that claimed to know the meaning of everything. There's also the issue of fear. Many people stay in belief because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't. Eternal punishment is the biggest threat used by religions. The idea that if you doubt or step outside the faith, you'll suffer forever. But when you examine it closely, this is emotional blackmail, not truth. The fact that a belief uses threats to keep you in line should make us more suspicious of it, not less. If a political system worked that way, we'd immediately call it authoritarian. Yet when a religion does it, people call it holy. And honestly, the concept of eternal punishment doesn't even make sense. A finite life filled with finite mistakes doesn't justify infinite torture. If a human judge sentenced someone to eternal suffering for stealing or lying, we'd call it monstrous. But when religion attributes that to God, it's framed as justice. That contradiction was another point where belief just broke down for me. I also found it important to look at how religion interacts with science. Over and over, we've seen clashes, from Galileo being condemned for suggesting Earth moves around the sun, to Darwin's theory of evolution being rejected because it conflicted with literal creation stories. Religion tends to resist new knowledge when it threatens old doctrines. But knowledge wins eventually because reality doesn't bend to belief. This resistance isn't harmless either. Even today, denial of evolution, or climate science or medical research often comes from religious motivations. That slows progress and harms lives. If a belief were truly divine truth, it shouldn't crumble under the weight of evidence, but that's exactly what keeps happening. Another angle I considered was the diversity of gods themselves. If there really were one true God, Why would the record of human belief be so crowded with thousands of them across time? Why would their commands and personalities contradict each other so sharply? Some gods demand blood sacrifice, others forbid it. Some allow multiple wives, others forbid more than one. Some command love, others command conquest. When every group is equally convinced they have the truth, the only consistent conclusion is that none of them do, and I can't ignore how much suffering has been fueled by these conflicting beliefs. Holy wars, inquisitions, witch hunts, religious terrorism. These weren't accidental side effects. They were carried out in the name of serving God. If religion were truly the highest source of morality, it wouldn't be the justification for some of the darkest chapters in human history. Now, it's true that religion has also inspired art, music, and community. But that's because people are capable of creating beauty, not because a god dictated it. Michelangelo didn't need divine inspiration to sculpt the Pietà. He needed skill, practice, and human creativity. The music of Bach, the architecture of cathedrals, these things show the power of human imagination, not proof of God. Humans create meaning whether or not gods exist. What I realized is that people often confuse the feelings religion gives them with evidence of its truth. A moving hymn, a sense of belonging, the comfort of prayer, these are powerful experiences. But feeling something deeply doesn't make the source of the feeling real. A child feels deeply when believing in Santa Claus too, but that doesn't mean Santa is real. So when I asked myself, why don't I believe in God? The answer became clearer the more I examined it. Because every argument for God either collapses under scrutiny or points back to human imagination rather than reality. Because the world we live in makes far more sense without assuming a divine overseer. And because accepting the truth, even when it's difficult, is better than holding on to comforting illusions. One of the most powerful things I noticed when I stepped away from belief was how much of religion depends on early conditioning. If you ask adults why they believe, many will give philosophical or moral reasons. But if you press deeper, the truth usually comes out. They were raised that way. They were told about God before they even understood what evidence was. They were taught to pray before they learned critical thinking. By the time they're old enough to question, belief already feels like part of their identity, not an idea to be examined. That's not unique to one religion. It's universal. Children born into Hindu families almost always grow up Hindu. Children born into Christian families almost always grow up Christian. The beliefs feel natural not because they're true, but because they're familiar. And once something is deeply familiar, it's difficult to let go of it. That realization helped me see that belief is often more about geography and upbringing than about truth. Psychology backs this up. Studies show that children are highly prone to accepting authority figures without question. It's an evolutionary advantage. If a parent says, "Don't touch the fire," the child doesn't demand evidence, they just obey. Religion leverages this natural trust, embedding ideas about gods and the supernatural before children have the tools to critically evaluate them. By the time those tools develop, the belief is already entrenched. Another layer I found compelling was how much our brains are wired to see patterns and intentions, even when they aren't there. Humans evolved to assume agency. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, it's safer to assume it's a predator than to dismiss it. That same instinct leads us to see purpose in randomness. A storm isn't just weather, it must be punishment. A disease isn't just biology, it must be a curse. This agency detection was once useful for survival, but today it explains why supernatural beliefs arise so easily. We're pattern seekers, sometimes too much so. Cognitive science also shows that religious experiences, like feelings of transcendence, awe, or divine presence, can be recreated in laboratories. Psychedelic drugs can trigger visions that feel profoundly spiritual. Meditation can create sensations of unity with the universe. Electrical stimulation of the brain can evoke the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. These aren't signs of the divine. They're signs of how the brain constructs meaning and sensation. This doesn't make the experiences worthless. They're still deeply human and often beautiful, but they don't prove an external God. They prove that our minds are capable of producing extraordinary states on their own. Another issue that pushed me away from belief was the problem of exclusivity. Most religions don't just claim to be true, they claim to be the only truth. If you're outside the circle, you're lost, condemned, or spiritually inferior. But with so many competing exclusive claims, they cancel each other out. If Christians say salvation only comes through Christ, and Muslims say it only comes through Islam, and Hindus say liberation comes through their path, then logically, most of the world is always wrong in someone's eyes. That's not a system that looks designed by a benevolent, universal God. It looks like a system of competing human ideologies. And when you look at how these exclusive claims play out in real life, the consequences are serious. Wars fought over whose God is real, Families divided because of different beliefs, people condemned or even killed for questioning or leaving a faith. If belief were really about love and truth, why would it so often result in violence and division? Then there's the argument from complexity, the idea that the universe is too finely tuned, too intricate to exist without a designer. At first glance, that sounds persuasive, but when you look closer, it falls apart. The universe isn't designed for life, it's almost entirely hostile to it. Most of space is a vacuum filled with deadly radiation. Most planets are barren. Even on Earth, life has been nearly wiped out multiple times by natural disasters. If this is the work of a designer, it's an oddly inefficient one. On the other hand, if we consider natural processes like evolution and physics, the picture makes more sense. Life didn't appear everywhere. It appeared in rare pockets where conditions were right, and once it appeared, it adapted to survive. We're not here because the universe was designed for us. We're here because we happen to fit the narrow conditions that allowed us to evolve. That's not divine intention. It's probability and natural law. When people bring up the idea of a loving creator, I also can't ignore the sheer indifference of the natural world. Earthquakes bury entire cities, tsunamis wipe out villages, diseases kill millions indiscriminately. These things happened long before modern science, and people explain them as punishment from God. But now we know they're natural processes, shifts in tectonic plates, movements of water, mutations of viruses. And knowing that, it's impossible to keep framing them as part of a benevolent plan. A God who allows children to die in earthquakes or from cancer without lifting a hand is either not loving, not powerful, or not real. Over time, I also noticed that the God people describe seems to shrink as our knowledge expands. When we didn't know what caused lightning, it was God. When we didn't know what caused plagues, it was God. Now, God is often said to live in the gaps science hasn't explained yet, but those gaps keep getting smaller, and a God who only exists in the places we don't understand isn't much of a God, it's just a placeholder for ignorance. I also think about how religion often discourages doubt. In many traditions, doubt is considered sinful or dangerous, but if truth is real, it shouldn't fear questioning. Science doesn't punish doubt, it thrives on it. Every discovery begins with doubt, with someone saying, "What if the current explanation is wrong?" The fact that religions are so defensive against doubt shows me that they're fragile systems. They depend on insulation from criticism to survive. And the moment I stopped fearing doubt, I saw belief differently. I realized that if a God truly existed, he wouldn't need human institutions to protect his reputation. He wouldn't need people to threaten punishment for disbelief. Reality would speak for itself. The fact that it doesn't is why I can't believe. One thing that kept coming up for me is how belief in God so often serves human power more than human understanding. When kings and emperors ruled, they didn't just claim authority through force, they claimed it through God. The divine right of kings wasn't about truth, it was about keeping people obedient. The same goes for religious leaders who declare that questioning them is the same as questioning God. That's not divine authority, it's human authority dressed up in sacred clothing. Even today, we see how religion shapes politics in ways that reveal its human roots. Laws influenced by scripture rather than reason often end up restricting freedom rather than protecting it. Whether it's about who people can marry, what women can do with their bodies, or how science is taught in schools, religion often inserts itself into areas where belief shouldn't dictate policy. And the result is conflict. Because when one group insists their personal faith should rule over everyone else, that's not morality, it's control. This becomes even clearer when we notice that morality progresses despite religion, not because of it. Abolition of slavery, recognition of women's rights, acceptance of LGBTQ people. These changes didn't come from religious institutions. In most cases, they were resisted by them. Progress came from people who questioned, who challenged old interpretations, who refused to let scripture justify cruelty. And eventually, religious groups had to adapt, reinterpreting their texts to keep up with the moral progress that came from outside. That shows us something crucial. Morality evolves as societies grow, but religion lags behind and only adjusts when it has no choice. I also think about how belief in God often divides humanity into insiders and outsiders, the faithful and the unbelievers, the saved and the damned. This creates walls between people who otherwise might share the same values, hopes, and struggles. And these divisions have been used to justify persecution, discrimination, and violence for centuries. If belief in God were truly about love and unity, why would it consistently create so much division? Another angle that always stood out to me is how belief relies heavily on selective thinking. When something good happens, people thank God. When something bad happens, they say God works in mysterious ways. No matter what occurs, the belief system bends to fit it. But that's not a sign of truth. It's a sign of unfalsifiability. If a belief can never be wrong, no matter the evidence, then it's not based on reality. It's based on refusal to question. The same goes for so-called miracles. People point to a rare recovery from illness as proof of God's hand, but they don't call the thousands of ordinary deaths proof against him. Survivorship bias makes us notice the unusual outcome and ignore the countless ordinary ones. If God really intervened in human affairs, we wouldn't see the same predictable patterns of disease, disaster, and chance. We'd see unmistakable, consistent signs. But we don't. There's also the psychological side of belief that fascinated me. Studies show that religious belief often thrives in environments of uncertainty and hardship. Places with higher poverty, instability, or suffering tend to have stronger religious devotion. That suggests belief functions as a coping mechanism more than a response to truth. When life is unpredictable and harsh, belief offers comfort, but comfort doesn't equal accuracy. A placebo can ease pain without curing disease, and belief in God can ease fear without revealing truth. At the same time, I don't think people believe out of foolishness. I think they believe because humans need meaning, community, and hope. Religion offers all of that in a ready-made package. But once I realized that, I also realized those needs can be met without God. Meaning can come from relationships, from work, from creativity. Community can be built through shared values and mutual support. Hope can come from striving for a better future rather than waiting for a promised one. One under-discussed point for me was how belief in God often creates unnecessary guilt and fear. People grow up being told that their natural thoughts, desires, and questions are sinful, that even thinking critically about their faith could condemn them. This creates a cycle of self-policing, where people feel guilty not just for actions, but for feelings. And that guilt isn't born from reality. It's born from dogma. When I stepped away from belief, I noticed how much lighter life felt without that unnecessary burden. And then there's death. The fear of death is one of the strongest reasons people cling to God. The promise of an afterlife feels like a safety net. But I came to see that accepting mortality doesn't make life bleak. It makes it precious. Knowing that life ends gives weight to every moment. It pushes us to cherish the time we have, to love fully, to create, to explore. The idea that we only find meaning in an eternal afterlife actually robs this life of its full significance. The more I examined these aspects, the more I saw that belief in God isn't about evidence. It's about human needs, culture, and psychology. And when those things are stripped away, what's left is a claim without support. That's why, when I ask myself honestly, I can't believe. Another thing I began noticing is how religions adapt over time, reshaping themselves to survive cultural change. When science contradicted scripture, religions adjusted their interpretations. When society condemned practices like slavery or stoning, religions softened or reinterpreted their texts. This adaptability shows that religion isn't timeless truth. It's a flexible human system, constantly reworked to avoid collapse. A true divine revelation shouldn't need editing every generation. It's striking how even within the same faith, people pick and choose. Believers in the modern world don't follow every command in their holy books. They ignore some, reinterpret others, and highlight the ones that fit today's moral standards. That selectivity reveals something important. Morality comes first, and scripture gets bent to match it. If morality really came from God, it would be the other way around. I also started to think about prayer in a different way. Billions of prayers are said every day. Pleas for healing, safety, guidance, or comfort. If prayer truly worked as advertised, the world would look very different. We'd see consistent, measurable outcomes that couldn't be explained any other way. But instead, prayer outcomes match random chance. People pray, and sometimes recover, sometimes don't, just like those who don't pray. The only reliable effect prayer seems to have is psychological. It calms people, helps them focus, eases anxiety, which is valuable. But again, that's the power of the human mind, not evidence of God's hand. When I looked at history, the same pattern repeated. Plagues, droughts, wars. People prayed for deliverance, but natural events played out regardless. If God were actively intervening in human affairs, history wouldn't look like a record of nature and human decision. It would look like a record of supernatural corrections. But it doesn't. Something else that struck me was how belief often thrives on mystery. When something is unexplained, people are quick to insert God as the answer. But every time we've explained a mystery through science, the need for God in that area vanished. People once thought mental illness was possession by demons. Now we know it's neurological and psychological. People thought earthquakes were divine punishment. Now we know about tectonic plates. The list goes on. The shrinking role of God in explaining the world shows that belief fills gaps in knowledge, not gaps in reality. I also considered the philosophical arguments people often bring up. The cosmological argument says there must be a first cause, and that cause is God. But even if there were a first cause, why assume it's a personal God who cares about human affairs? That leap isn't justified. And if everything needs a cause, then God would too. If God doesn't, then maybe the universe doesn't either. The teleological argument says the universe looks designed, but like I mentioned earlier, most of the universe is hostile to life, and the parts where life exists follow natural processes we can study. If life adapts to fit its environment through evolution, then design isn't needed. It's like seeing a puddle of water on the ground and saying the hole it's in must have been designed for the puddle. No, the water simply fills the shape available. Life does the same in the universe. The moral argument says we need God for objective morality. But when we look closely, morality clearly predates and transcends Scripture. It's rooted in empathy, cooperation, and the survival of social species. If morality came only from God, we'd expect religious people to behave far more morally than non-religious people. But studies show that rates of kindness, generosity, and ethical behavior don't depend on belief. They depend on culture, stability, and empathy. Then, there's Pascal's wager, the idea that it's safer to believe just in case God is real. But belief doesn't work like that. You can't just will yourself to believe something because it's convenient. And which God should you believe in, just in case? Belief based on fear of punishment isn't sincere, it's hedging bets. And if there were a God worth respecting, would he really reward dishonest belief over honest doubt? Another under-discussed point is how belief can stunt curiosity. When you accept God did it as the answer, you stop asking deeper questions. Lightning is no longer a phenomenon to study, it's an act of God. Illness is no longer biology, it's punishment or testing. That mindset closes doors instead of opening them. By contrast, when you remove God as the default answer, you start investigating, and that's how progress is made. I also thought about how uneven God's supposed revelation is. If there really were an all-powerful being wanting to be known, why reveal himself in obscure ancient texts that require endless interpretation? Why not provide clear universal evidence accessible to everyone in every culture? Instead, we're left with conflicting scriptures, each claiming to be absolute truth and none standing up to consistent scrutiny. A God who hides in ambiguity looks suspiciously like a God invented by humans. One of the strongest personal realizations for me was how much more responsibility I felt once I let go of God. When you believe in a divine overseer, it's tempting to shift responsibility upward. God will handle it. God will provide. God has a plan. But when you accept that there's no cosmic caretaker, you realize it's on us. If we want a better world, we have to build it. If we want justice, we have to fight for it. If we want meaning, we have to create it. That realization isn't bleak, it's empowering. I can't pretend the process of letting go was easy. For a long time, I wrestled with doubt, with fear of being wrong, with the weight of stepping outside tradition. But the more I trusted evidence over fear, the clearer things became. Belief in God wasn't necessary to make sense of the world, and it wasn't supported by reality. It was something humans made, not something reality revealed. When I looked beyond my own experience, I found plenty of examples of people and even whole societies thriving without belief in God. Countries with some of the lowest levels of religious belief, places like Sweden, Denmark, Japan, and the Netherlands, consistently rank high in measures of happiness, education, equality, and social trust. These aren't godless wastelands of despair. They're some of the most peaceful and stable places in the world. That tells me belief in God isn't required for flourishing. What matters is human effort, good governance, compassion, and cooperation. On the individual level, I've met people who left their faith and discovered a new kind of resilience. Instead of relying on prayer when life got hard, they turned to problem solving, to therapy, to friends, to building stronger communities. Instead of waiting for divine intervention, they acted. And what's remarkable is that many of them describe feeling more grounded, more authentic, and more at peace once they stopped trying to force belief. Psychological research backs this up. While religion can provide comfort, people without religious belief can find equal or greater resilience through meaning-making, mindfulness, relationships, and purpose-driven action. Human beings are meaning creators. We don't need divine scripts. We can write our own. And when I think about societies that centered belief too heavily, the contrast is stark. Theocracies where religion dominates politics often struggle with repression, lack of freedom, and stagnation. When human creativity is forced to stay inside the boundaries of dogma, progress slows. But when people are allowed to question and explore freely, knowledge grows, rights expand, and life improves. The evidence shows us that letting go of rigid belief isn't a path to chaos, it's a path to growth. Something I rarely heard discussed while I was still inside belief is how liberating it is to say, I don't know. Religion often pushes ready-made answers, even when they're unsatisfying. But the truth is, there are still mysteries in the universe. We don't yet know what sparked the Big Bang, or exactly how consciousness arises, or what might exist beyond the observable universe. For me, acknowledging I don't know is more honest and more powerful than pretending an ancient text already solved it. Because I don't know is the starting point of discovery, while God did it is the end of questioning. Another important shift for me was learning to embrace wonder without attaching it to the supernatural. The fact that we're made of stardust, that atoms forged in dying stars make up our bodies, the fact that evolution produced the endless variety of life we see around us, the fact that our brains can look out into the cosmos and reflect on our own existence. None of this requires belief in God to be awe-inspiring. If anything, it deepens the sense of wonder, because it's real. It's not a story, it's reality, and reality is astonishing enough on its own. Of course, people sometimes ask me, what if you're wrong? And the truth is, if I'm wrong, and there really is a God, I'd hope that such a being values honesty more than blind acceptance. That if I lived my life trying to seek truth, to be kind, to take responsibility, and to face reality as best I could, that would matter more than reciting the right words or following the right rituals. If a God would punish honest doubt but reward blind belief, that's not a God worth worshipping. So why don't I believe in God? Because when I strip away fear, tradition, and habit, there's no solid reason left to hold on. Because the explanations of the natural world stand stronger without invoking the supernatural. Because morality, meaning, and purpose are human creations, not divine commands. Because the silence of unanswered prayers, the contradictions of Scripture, and the violence justified in God's name all point back to human invention. But maybe the deepest reason is this: life feels more real without belief in God. When I stopped waiting for a higher plan, I started to see the beauty of living fully in the present. When I stopped thinking about eternity, I started valuing the limited time I have. When I stopped framing everything as a test or trial, I began appreciating it for what it is: messy, fragile, unpredictable, but also full of possibility. Not believing in God didn't take anything away from me. It gave me something. It gave me the courage to face uncertainty without fear. It gave me the responsibility to build my own meaning. It gave me a deeper respect for the reality we actually inhabit. And that's why, when people ask me why I don't believe in God, I don't answer with hostility or mockery. I answer with clarity. Because I've looked at the evidence, I've asked the questions, and I've lived with the answers, and in the end, I've found more truth, more freedom, and more wonder outside of belief than I ever found within it.